Okay. Um, you've finished the character charts now. Half of the class studied Tom and half of the class studied Huck. And I want you to be thinking now about the differences between Tom and Huck. Um, we really get a sense of these differences. I mean, you do throughout when he's talking about robbers and the practicalities that Huck considers and the sort of fantasies that Tom considers. But I think we also get this difference very clearly when we are looking at the way that Tom and Huck think about Jim and how they treat Jim. And that becomes the central relationship of this book: Tom, Huck, and Jim, mostly Huck and Jim, but Tom as well. Um, and so it's important to consider how they are setting themselves apart. So I want to have you go to page 2. And actually, I'm going to stop the share for a second. Go to page 2. At the bottom of the page, I really want you to open the books and read this because, like I said, we're not using the words in class, a certain word here. And so I am going to skip it here, and you can see what it actually says in the book. So it says, Miss Watson, she kept pecking at me, and it got tiresome and lonesome. And I want you to think more about that word lonesome as we go forward. What does it mean that Huck is lonesome, and what does he think of being lonesome? By and by, they fetched the inn and had prayers, and then everybody was off to bed. I went up to my room with a piece of candle and put it on the table. Then I sat down in a chair by the window and tried to think of something cheerful, but it weren't no use. I felt so lonesome. I most wished I was dead. All right, so I think what happens here, this is the first time he uses the N word in this book. And it's in such a callous way, but it's not in the insulting, directed way that we might be used to seeing it in contemporary literature. So here he seems to be almost clueless about the racial hierarchy that exists. It's Miss Watson, she keeps pecking at him, basically like, trying to get him to act a certain way, act a way that is proprietous, like act in a way with good manners. She just keeps pecking at him and pecking at him, and he's getting so tired of it, like he's frustrated and annoyed, but it's also making him lonesome. It's making him feel like an outsider. You think about the way that Huck has been brought into this family and doesn't understand anything that they're doing, doesn't know how to read, doesn't go to school, and they're kind of just expecting him to live up to kind of their social expectations. And these aren't moral expectations, it's stuff like, don't scrunch up like that, Huckleberry. Don't put your feet up there, Huckleberry. Don't gap and stretch like that, Huckleberry. Why don't you try to behave? And she assigns moral qualities to those things that are just manners. Like, she's like, oh, you're being wicked. Like, you're going to go to hell because you're not, I don't know, you're putting your elbows on the table, or you're stretching in a way that it makes me, makes me uncomfortable. Like, because it's like sort of being loud and in your face with like bodily functions, like it feels good to like stretch out. And she's just like, no, stay proprietous, stay sort of in your little area. And it's really interesting to me that Twain says this thing about him being tiresome and lonesome, about feeling like an outsider, but then says, by and by they fetched the N-words and then had prayers, and then everybody was off to bed. And there's this way that that hierarchy exists with Miss Watson's slaves, and that he doesn't even question the relationship there, that it's like they're fetched, right? These people who, they're adults. We learn that she has adult slaves, and they are sort of like summoned to come in and experience prayers. And we heard about the hypocrisy that Douglas identified in his book. And here, even though Twain is not being explicit about that hypocrisy, by putting those two words, the N word and then prayers, in juxtaposition with each other, he's pointing out that hypocrisy a little bit. It's like, we're going to call them this derogatory name, which has always been derogatory. It's not like that became, it's not like other terms that we used to use and they were okay and they were proper, but now they aren't anymore. Words like Negro or colored, we don't say those anymore because they've gotten us a reputation, and people have misused them in ways that were like racist, right? No, the N-word has always been racist and derogatory and disgusting, especially for white people to say to Black people, right? It's different with Black people with each other, but it's always had that history. And so here he uses it. So Huck here, it's in the voice of Huck. He uses it so casually with in conjunction with this idea of prayer that he's just clueless about it. This is just who the people are. This is their place in the social hierarchy. And what is ironic here is that he's feeling tiresome and lonesome because of the way that he fits into that social hierarchy down at the bottom, he thinks, right? But but he doesn't have any empathy for this juxtaposition that he just created. He doesn't realize that this would be an offensive way to refer to people. It is just like a part of his culture. And so you kind of get this idea that he hasn't developed that sense of empathy yet. And you see this again on the next page. So turn to page 4. And at the bottom, Tom and Huck are going to have like a little bit of fun. They're going out for their adventure with their robber gang. And Tom gets this idea that he wants to tie Jim to a tree. So they're worried about waking Jim up because Jim is an adult. Even though he's Black, he's still an adult and he could get them in trouble. It says, Tom, he made a sign to me, kind of a little noise with his mouth, and we went creeping away on our hands and knees. When he was 10 foot off, Tom whispered to me and wanted to tie Jim to the tree for fun, but I said no, he might wake and make a disturbance, and then they'd find out I weren't in. Then Tom said he hadn't got candles enough and he would slip in the kitchen and get some more. I didn't want him to try. I said Jim might wake up and come, but Tom wanted to risk it. So we slid in there and got 3 candles, and Tom laid 5 cents on the table for pay. Then we got out and I was in a sweat to get away, but nothing would do Tom, but he must crawl to where Jim was on his hands and knees and play something on him. I waited and it seemed a good while. Everything was so still and lonesome. So again, lonesome, that word, that he's like seeing himself as this kind of like outsider. I don't have company. I don't have people like that see things the way that I see things. And yet he doesn't realize that maybe tying Jim to a tree and putting his hat above his head and making him think that like someone's been messing with him would be a cruel thing to do. It's a mean prank, and Tom has meanness in mind when he makes that prank. It's not that he's saying like, oh, I hate Jim and I want to, make him pay for something. It's not revenge or anything, but it's like this way of like, the way that little kids are just like totally selfish. And so they don't realize that their actions might affect other people. All he's thinking about is his fun. And on the other hand, I think that Huck sees it a different way. Huck knows he's an outsider, knows that his position in Miss Watson's house is not as secure as Tom's is in his Aunt Polly's. And so at any time, Huck could be sent away. He's not a blood relation. Miss Watson has no sort of obligation to take care of him. And so he's scared. So he also is not feeling empathy for Jim, but his reason for not wanting to do it is not because like, oh, I see Jim as a person and I don't want to pull this mean prank on him. No, it's because he's afraid for himself. So he's having similar feelings as we could imagine that Jim has throughout these first 8 chapters. But he doesn't really start to see Jim as a person with emotions that he needs to pay attention to until a little bit later. There's a line in this, and I'm kind of skipping ahead, but I just have to point it out to you because it really is the cutest, nicest line of this whole book. It just makes me so happy. He says, I was ever so glad to see Jim. This is him on the island. I was ever so glad to see Jim. I weren't lonesome now. So he's calling himself lonesome. Look, oh, it's so cute. He's calling himself lonesome for pages and pages at the beginning of this. He's an he's not an orphan really, but like, his dad is super abusive to him and he doesn't have a mother to take care of him. And he's just like sort of an outcast in society. And he keeps thinking about how lonesome he is being an outcast. And he gets to this island and Jim shows up and he weren't lonesome anymore. So that's kind of where we start to see that he is seeing something in Jim that he might be able to connect with more. So anyway, that is getting ahead of ourselves, but I want to have you answer a couple questions now. So you are going to answer Why does Tom want to tie up Jim? We kind of talked about that in this video, but I want you to reiterate. What does Tom's motivation and actions, I should say, what do Tom's motivations and actions reveal about his relationship to authority? And question 3, do you think that Tom's payment for the candles was a fair exchange? He laid 5 cents on the table for a pay. Do you think that's a fair exchange? I'm sorry, I don't know why I can't type today. All right, so I want you to answer those 3 questions in your notes so that I can see that you paid attention to this video.